So this past weekend, we had Playtest 6, and I'm genuinely curious how many of you also played Playtest 6? Or how many of you have played any of the playtests? Just one of them, regardless of whether you liked it or not. And I ask because I do feel like I've started to see some trends, especially with Playtest 6, that are happening, and I'm trying to figure out why. So before we get into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and leave a like on the video, and of course, comment and let me know what playtest you played on. And if you haven't, let me know why. So if you weren't aware, Playtest 5 was canceled. Playtest 5 released and unfortunately became a one life, one spawn experience where if you gave up, your game was likely to crash. OWI I don't think was able to fix that in time for the playtest to be very meaningful, so they just canceled it. Playtest 6 didn't feature anything that new that wasn't featured in Playtest 5 other than it didn't crash whenever you gave up. But there were two factions that were added for Playtest 5, which were the Middle East Alliance and the United States Marine Corps. I'll be upfront and say I didn't actually get an opportunity to play much of the United States Marine Corps, which is okay because I wasn't really too concerned about that as much as I wanted to see the Middle East Alliance and their weapons, specifically the G3 with a magnified scope. And of course, there's several different options out there that you could try given different weaponry with different scopes, red dots, iron sights. I'm starting to focus more so on just what I know I'm going to end up using as an SL or as a rifleman. So one note that OWI made was that the G3 are going to be harder to maneuver, have lower magazine capacity, but pack an extra punch in both damage and suppression. And these changes were noticeable. After firing through the scope a few times, what I noticed is that the second shot took so long to follow up, especially if your target wasn't dead from the first shot. So what I found is I'm learning the mechanic with situations where I would hit maybe my first shot, and as the recoil was stabilizing, I would look and that person was crawling behind something, so I didn't even get the follow-up shot if they were still alive. However, there were times where the first shot was enough, so there is more of a punch packed with this weapon. So obviously maneuverability is different and the recoil is intense. Just take a look at the example here where we go to the range and we see what it looks like, and then in comparison to what it is in the live version of the game, there is a significant difference in how this gun operates. Not to mention how much less of the screen this scope takes up compared to the live version of the game. It is pretty small. To me, this just feels like one of the most drastic differences in terms of a specific gun going from live version to the playtest. Now on the flip side, I feel like I've gotten a handle on the ACOG. Along with some other scopes like the Canadian rifle, I'm still having a little bit of trouble with the Russian standard magnified scope. It's still giving me a little bit of a pain, especially for how much screen it takes up. It's hard for me to make certain adjustments. But ultimately, I feel like something like the ACOG, which has been in since the first playtest, we're starting to see close to where it's going to land. And that's primarily just the fact that most of the changes in these newer playtests are focused on newer weapons or factions added more recently along with tweaks. I'm also wondering how hard this makes the MEA faction to play, especially when using magnified scopes. How does this change their style of gameplay? And while I have a better understanding of certain weaponry, I feel like this gun, the G3 plus its scope, is going to give me the hardest time and learning curve to being able to adapt to how it operates. And simultaneously, you do realize that certain factions just have better weaponry suited for the battlefield. While I think this might be the hardest adjustment for me that I've seen so far and the weaponry that's getting these updates, I do think it's going to continue to play a significant impact on how we play the game at a just bare bones level in terms of tactics and strategy. And maybe this also implies that certain factions cannot repeat the same tactic you use from faction to faction. While you may be able to play the same layer, your tactics need to be adjusted accordingly. And I don't just mean in the sense of like what vehicles you have or some basic positioning, I mean like your infantry capability. In addition to adding these two factions, some tweaks to some of the other weaponry, especially newer stuff, they did a couple UI changes which I thought were interesting. They added a proximity indicator which appears in the HUD squad list, so you can tell which squad members are within your local voice range. They also made it so that if you have your HUD squad list active, it actually shows who's speaking within that, instead of setting up like a separate area for their name to be listed as they talk. I think both of these changes are kind of neat. I mean, frankly, the proximity indicator would be really useful to know who's around you without having to check your map. Secondly, the HUD squad list, being able to show who's speaking, just sort of cleans up the UI in general. In addition to these things, player name tags no longer appear through walls and obstacles, along with the fact that player name tags and other world icons fade out when looking through a scope. So as always, it's important to know what camo you're wearing, your team is wearing, versus what the other team is wearing, because I feel like this is going to heighten that need just a little bit. So you may remember when I did a video on Playtest 4, I was running into a lot of performance issues. I was on a backup video card being a 3060 Ti running basically medium settings in DirectX 12. Whereas for this playtest, I got my 3090 back, I'm back on high settings and DirectX 12, and things ran relatively smooth. I mean, much smoother than they did for Playtest 4. I didn't have constant frame drop. I wasn't just, stuttering across the screen. There are moments where you see some performance drop. There are things that happen and you're going to see some frames being lost, but overall it was much improved from Playtest 4. Now again, different video card, so not a scientific comparison. Now, on top of looking at the MEA faction and trying to determine where they land with this playtest, I also wanted to discuss the trend that I'm kind of seeing that I mentioned earlier, and that's that I'm seeing a lot of newer players playing the playtest. And I don't know if this is necessarily a bad thing, and it's not all the time, but there's been several instances where I just find that the gameplay kind of is lacking. So I was kind of wondering how many folks that have been a part of multiple playtests now, or that have been playing in at least a couple of them periodically, are starting to see fatigue from the playtests themselves, versus how many folks are actually coming onto the playtest for one of their earlier experiences in playing Squad. I'm sure that they're going to hear about it based on the content created. I don't know if just it being a playtest tends to lend itself to a little bit less inspired play. I know people want to get into gunfights and see how the things operate, but what I find really curious is that when I start to play and then I notice that folks just aren't doing some of the fundamental things that you expect veteran squad leaders to do, or they're just asking questions and you can kind of tell that, hey, they don't have a ton of hours. It creates an interesting scenario in the playtest where you're wanting to play at a high level so that you can get in those gunfights and see what's going on, but we were having to do a little bit more covering up for other situations happening than I would expect in a playtest. And again, I've seen this more than just in Playtest 6. I've seen it in other playtests too, where just the gameplay is just a little bit not what I would expect. Maybe it's just me, so if you guys have been witnessing something different or the same thing, let me know. I admit that I think we're all probably dealing with some playtest fatigue. I did give it several rounds and I really wanted to try the MEA scope because I feel like that's going to be a pretty significant jump in terms of what we have in the live version versus what we have in the playtest. Ultimately, I hope that folks are still diving into the playtest and giving feedback, because that's going to be really, really important moving forward as we start to see some of the last factions getting added to the playtest. If you did play Playtest 6, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you sort of experienced, not only in terms of the mechanics, how they operated, but also with regards to what you experienced in a given round. I could also assume that maybe after Playtest 5, some folks have taken a step back to let OWI work on some things and they'll eventually come back, and maybe that's when things get a little more energized. Additionally, do you guys feel like the MEA is probably going to be the harder faction to adjust to, especially when using magnified scopes? Because I do. I think that's going to be probably the more difficult learning curve for me, just based on usage so far. But again, there's plenty more that they can do to continue to polish this experience. This video is very much a conversation topic. I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are, how you felt about the playtest, or how you feel about the playtest in general. So let me know down below. Be sure to subscribe and leave a like on the video, and I'll catch you guys next time.